Frank Lloyd Wright is considered one of the most influential architects in history. Now, one time he was tasked with building what was called the Imperial Hotel in the city of Tokyo. But as you may know, Tokyo has a very long history of very violent earthquakes. And so Wright wanted to try to find a foundation that would be able to withstand the movement of the earth. Wright's solution was to float, essentially, a solid foundation in a deep cushion of 60 feet of soft mud. And shortly after the hotel was completed, Tokyo experienced the strongest earthquake that they'd had in 52 years. And how did Wright's hotel do? Well, it stood. It withstood the earthquake, although many other buildings around the hotel collapsed. See, Frank Lloyd Wright understood that if you're going to build, that you need to build on a solid foundation. And that's what today's Dining Room Devo is about. We're looking at Galatians 2, verses 17 through 19. If, while we seek to be justified in Christ, it becomes evident that we ourselves are sinners, does that mean that Christ promotes sin? Absolutely not. If I rebuild what I destroyed, I prove that I am a lawbreaker. For through the law, I died to the law so that I might live for God. In this passage, as well as other passages we've looked at over the last several videos, Paul is referring to the event where he called out Peter and others in the city of Antioch who had essentially allowed the church to be segregated into Jewish and Gentile camps. Those who had the law of Moses and followed it, the Jews, versus those who didn't have the law and didn't follow it, which were the Gentile Christians. And Paul's been making the case that both Jews and Gentiles alike are made right with God through faith in Jesus Christ and not through following the law of Moses. And these verses that we're looking at today can be a little bit difficult to understand, so hopefully we can make some sense of what Paul is saying in verses 17 through 19. And in verse 17, really what Paul is doing is he's addressing a common excuse for legalism, for creating a bunch of rules for people to follow. And that excuse is that if you don't tell people what to do, that they are going to wander into all sorts of trouble. So the argument from the Judaizers was that the Gentiles need the constraints of the law of Moses so that they don't fall into the immoral living that they had experienced before they came to Christ. So the accusation then is that if Christ accepts Gentile sinners just the way they are, without the law of Moses, then maybe Jesus doesn't care too much about sin. And if that's the case, then you might say that Jesus even promotes sin, since Jesus promotes the destruction of the guardrails that keep us from sinning, those guardrails being the constraints in the law of Moses. You know, if you had kids, you probably remember putting up baby gates when they were toddlers, right? So that they couldn't go where it wasn't safe. You know, we've seen these baby gates, and some of them work better than others. At least that's what Jamie and I experienced. You know, and I remember we put a baby gate at our basement stairs. The stairs at our old house in Goshen were very steep and were wood and were very dangerous, and so we had to put up a baby gate there so that our babies wouldn't fall down those dangerous stairs. And I remember one time we put up a larger baby gate around our Christmas tree. So that our little girl wouldn't, get poked by the needles. But it wasn't enough to stop her from falling off of the couch into the baby gate. One of the funnier things that happened when our kids were little. She was fine. She wasn't hurt. But it was rather hilarious to watch. Baby gates are great for toddlers. But you really wouldn't want one for your 12-year-old, would you? Because hopefully by the time your kid is 12, you can trust them with a little bit more freedom. And what Paul is saying here is that with Christ's death and resurrection, that we don't need that baby gate anymore of the law of Moses. We can walk in freedom because we're led by the Spirit of God to give us wisdom, to help us understand what we should and shouldn't do. Having that foundation, that constraint of the law of Moses is no longer necessary. So Paul says in this verse that he tore that foundation down. And he describes this a little bit in Philippians 3, verses 4 through 6, how he had trusted in his own works and how he was really good at it. And this is what he says. He says, if anyone thinks he has reasons to put confidence in the flesh, and by the flesh he means his own ability to do the right things. He says, I have more. Circumcised on the 8th day, of the people of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, Hebrew of Hebrews. In regard to the law, a Pharisee. As for zeal, persecuting the church. As for legalistic righteousness, faultless. I mean, Paul says here that from an outward perspective, he could not be accused of sin. And his spiritual pedigree was flawless, but that doesn't make us sinless, does it? Coming from the right family or obeying all the right rules, it doesn't make us sinless. Because Jesus said that the outward sins that we commit come from the evil that is stored within our hearts. So even if our actions were perfect, we would still be guilty of sin in our thoughts, our attitudes, and in our motivations. Therefore, Jesus says, the law says that adultery is a sin. But Jesus says, really, if you lust after somebody, that's just as much of a sin. The outward sin that can be seen, adultery, is of course horrible, but the inward sin of lust is just as bad. And not only is murder, of course, despicable, but Jesus says if you harbor anger in God's eyes, it's really not much different than if you had actually killed the person. But we can be blameless in the eyes of men, but not in the eyes of God, because God sees what's in our heart. So a foundation that's built on our works, our outward things that we do, is bound to fail. And if we rebuild it, then we're committing a great sin, because as Christians, we understand that foundation cannot stand. And in verse 19, Paul says that through the law, I died to the law so that I might live for God. Through the law, I died to the law. Have you ever seen an M.C. Escher painting? M.C. Escher was an artist who was known for making impossible optical illusions. And you can't make sense of them because they violate the laws of nature and the law of perspective. And you really might as well not try to even figure them out because it's impossible. I'm showing you an example of an M.C. Escher painting right now. Perfect obedience to the law of Moses is kind of like an Escher painting. You can try, but you're just going to be frustrated. You're doomed to failure. So Paul says he died to the law. And what he means by that is that he had to give up his attempts to keep the law of Moses through his own efforts and instead shift his allegiance to Christ. In order to live for God, we have to admit our own efforts aren't going to get us where we need to go. We must put all of our trust in Jesus Christ and in the work that he did for us at the cross as the place where our new life begins, our new foundation begins at the cross of Jesus Christ. That's the solid foundation we can trust in. And in our next video, we're going to see how Paul furthers this idea of dying to the law of Moses. But I want to close with a question today. Are you increasingly frustrated because you just can't seem to shake a bad habit, or a pattern of negative thinking, or some kind of a secret sin? Maybe the problem is that you're trying to do it in your own power. Today, ask God to help you focus on Christ and to claim his sacrifice at the cross as the source of your freedom. And then trust God to help you live for Jesus Christ. Thank you for watching our video. May God bless you. We'll see you next time on Dining Room Devos with Pastor Jeff Estep.